I didn't want him dead. I didn't want my life to be ruined. I didn't plan this. Words like this come out too late sometimes due to the gravity of the crime committed. On the other hand, some of these convicted criminals had no regrets about committing these inhumane crimes. This video exposes a list of the most venomous but adorable women on death row. 11th, Aileen Wuornos. The life and death of America's most notorious female serial killer. Aileen Wuornos' story is one of tragedy and horror. She was convicted of killing 7 men between 1989 and 1990, claiming she only killed them in self-defense because they tried to sexually assault her. But her crimes made her infamous, and she became one of the most well-known female serial killers in US history. Wuornos' troubles started long before she became a killer. She had a rough, abusive childhood and struggled with mental health issues. After she was arrested in 1991 for killing her last victim, Walter Antonio, the media painted her as a troubled woman with a difficult past. During her trial, Wuornos acted erratically, which made people question whether she was guilty or if her mental state played a role in what happened. In 1992, Wuornos was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death. Her case sparked debates about the death penalty and how women are treated in the criminal justice system. On October 9, 2002, after spending more than a decade on death row, Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. Right before her death, she defiantly said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day, with Jesus June 6th. Like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." For her final meal, she only asked for a cup of coffee. Even though the media focused on her case, Wuornos remained strange and defiant until the end. Some see her as a tragic figure, while others see her as a cold-blooded killer. Either way, her story is a complicated mix of crime, punishment, and justice. Next up, we have Tiffany Cole, whose story of how she went from a seemingly normal teenager to a convicted murderer will shock you. 10. Tiffany Cole, a cold-blooded crime and its shocking aftermath. In 2005, Tiffany Cole was found guilty of a brutal crime, the kidnapping, robbery, and murder of an elderly couple, James and Helen Mitchell. The crime shocked everyone because of how cold and calculated it seemed. Cole, along with her accomplice Michael Jackson, tricked the Mitchells into a deadly trap. They took the couple from their home, tied them up, and drove them to a remote spot where they were buried alive. After the murders, Cole and Jackson continued to show no remorse. They took money from the Mitchells' bank accounts, acting like the victims' lives didn't matter at all. The crime was horrifying and showed just how cruel some people can be. During her trial, Cole's defense team tried to argue that she had been abused, but the evidence presented by the prosecution told a different story. Cole later said, "I'm sorry for what happened. I never meant for this to happen." But it was too late. The jury found her guilty, and in 2006 she was sentenced to death. It was clear she wasn't just a bystander, she was directly involved in planning and carrying out the murders. However, in 2011, her death sentence was changed to life in prison, which shocked many people who felt her crime deserved the death penalty. Now, Cole is serving a life sentence without the chance of parole. Unlike many people on death row, Cole didn't make any dramatic final statements or request a last meal. Instead, she's still in prison, serving her time. And then there's Krista Pike, who, at a very young age, was involved in the savage murder of a classmate. Her calmness and strange motives made her one of the youngest women ever sentenced to death, and her case has left a lasting impact on everyone who heard about it. 9. Krista Pike, the teenage murderess. Krista Gale. Pike, a teenager with a penchant for the occult, orchestrated a heinous crime that would shock the nation. In 1995, 18-year-old Krista, along with her boyfriend Tadarrell Shipp and friend Shadola Renee, Shad Holliman, brutally murdered 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer. The brutality of the crime was matched only by Krista's seeming lack of remorse, as evidenced by a letter she wrote to Tadarrell stating, "I'm gonna kill Colleen, I'm gonna make her suffer." As the trial unfolded, the prosecution presented a damning case against Krista, highlighting her obsession with the occult and her role as the mastermind behind the murder. The jury ultimately found her guilty of first-degree murder and she was sentenced to death. Despite her appeals, Krista's fate was sealed, and she was executed by lethal injection on February 12, 2001. In the hours leading up to her execution, Krista spent her final moments with her family and spiritual advisors, seeking solace and forgiveness. For her last meal, she requested a humble spread of a hamburger, fries, and a Dr. Pepper. As she lay on the execution table, Krista's final words were a poignant expression of regret. "I'm sorry, Mum. I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry for everything." With those words, Krista Pike's turbulent life came to a close, marking the end of a tragic and disturbing chapter in American true crime history. Let's head on to see the heartbreaking scenario of how Deborah Milk spent over 22 agonizing years on death row for a crime she didn't commit. Her fate hanging by a thread as a chilling miscarriage of justice unfolded, leaving her to battle not only for her freedom, but for the truth to finally come to light. 8. Deborah Milker, the case of a wrongful conviction and the struggle for justice. "I never did anything to hurt my son. I was innocent. And I know that now." These heartfelt words from Deborah Milk came after she was wrongfully convicted of the 1989 murder of her 4-year-old son, Christopher. The court cited the absence of credible evidence and the questionable nature of the supposed confession as reasons for the ruling. Deborah Milk's story is one of the most heart-wrenching and harrowing cases of wrongful conviction in American history. In 1989, Deborah, a young mother from Arizona, was accused of the murder of her 4-year-old son, Christopher. The case was based on a supposed confession that Deborah allegedly made to Detective Armando Saldate, a man with a long history of misconduct and accusations of sexual abuse. The confession, which was never recorded and relied solely on the detective's word, formed the foundation of the case against her. The prosecution's theory was that Deborah had conspired with 2 men, James Stiers and Kenneth Miller, to have her son killed for the $5,000 life insurance payout. However, there was no physical evidence linking her to the crime, and the story was deeply flawed. Despite the lack of any real proof, Deborah was convicted of first-degree murder in 1990 and sentenced to death. What followed was a nightmare of years spent on death row, fighting not only for her life, but for the truth to be heard. Deborah was isolated in the harsh conditions of Arizona's death row, enduring the agonizing uncertainty of a justice system that seemed set on condemning her, even though the very foundation of her conviction was shaky at best. Her fate began to shift when Detective Saldate's track record was finally brought to light. His history of deceit, misconduct, and abuse of power had been overlooked during Deborah's trial, and it was revealed that he had a history of coercing false confessions, particularly from vulnerable women. With this new evidence, the case against Deborah started to unravel. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that her confession, if it had even occurred, was inadmissible because of Saldate's history of misconduct, and there was no other evidence to support the charges. In 2013, after more than 2 decades spent fighting for her freedom, Deborah Milk was finally exonerated. The Ninth Circuit overturned her conviction, and the state dropped all charges against her. She had spent over 22 years on death row for a crime she did not commit, a miscarriage of justice that took far too long to be corrected. She was left to rebuild her life after the torment of losing her son, and spending years on death row for a crime she didn't commit. Yet, despite all of the heartache and trauma, Deborah has worked tirelessly to raise awareness about wrongful convictions and the potential for grave errors within the legal system, becoming a powerful advocate for criminal justice reform. 7. Ethel Rosenberg, a case of espionage and tragic end. Ethel Rosenberg is a name that's still remembered today, especially when people talk about the Cold War. She and her husband Julius were accused of spying for the Soviet Union in the 1950s, a time when America was really paranoid about communism. Their trial and execution sparked a lot of debate, and many people still question if they were treated fairly. It all started in 1950 when Julius was arrested for being part of a Soviet spy ring. Ethel was accused of helping him pass along secret information. They were both tried under the Espionage Act, and their case became a big deal during the Cold War. The main evidence against them came from Ethel's brother, David Greenglass, who said she was involved in the spy activities. But some people believed the evidence wasn't strong enough, and that her conviction was partly because of the fear and suspicion everyone had about communism at the time. Throughout the trial, Ethel always said she was innocent and couldn't understand why she was being blamed. In a letter to the judge, she wrote, "I am innocent of the charges against me, and I cannot understand why they have singled me out for such a monstrous injustice." Despite her protestations and the lack of real evidence, the jury found both Ethel and Julius guilty and sentenced them to death. As their execution day got closer, there was a lot of public outcry. Many people, especially those on the political left, argued that the trial was unfair and based on fear rather than facts. But the US government stuck to its decision. On June 19, 1953, Ethel and Julius were executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison in New York. Reports say Ethel stayed calm but was clearly upset. Julius held her hand, and they shared a few last words to comfort each other before their deaths. For her last meal, Ethel had roast beef, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. Just before she was executed, she said, "I regret nothing. I am proud of my children, and I hope they grow up to live in a better world." Those were her last words before her tragic death. To this day, people still argue about whether Ethel deserved to be executed, or if she was just a victim of the Cold War hysteria. Some think her punishment was too harsh, and the whole case remains a symbol of the fear and political battles of that time. But unlike Ethel, Jodi Arias' story is different. She claimed she killed her ex-boyfriend in self-defense, but her detailed and chilling account of how she brutally murdered him left a lot of people questioning her story. Was it really self-defense, or did she have other darker reasons for what she did? 6. Jodi Arias, the murder that captivated the nation. Jodi Arias became famous after her highly publicized trial for the 2008 murder of her ex-boyfriend Travis Alexander. What started out as a story of a broken relationship quickly turned into a story about obsession, betrayal, and violence that caught the attention of millions. Arias was convicted of first-degree murder for brutally stabbing and shooting Alexander in his home in Arizona, and the crime left many people questioning why she did it. The trial, which started in 2013, became a media sensation with Arias in the spotlight. She gave different versions of what happened before Alexander's death. At first, she denied being involved, but later said she killed him in self-defense after he attacked her. However, the crime was so violent, more than 27 stab wounds, a gunshot, and a throat slashing, that it made people question if her story was true. The prosecution argued that Arias had become obsessed with Alexander and was jealous, which led to her violent outburst during an emotional argument. Throughout the trial, Arias denied being guilty, but her changing stories made it hard for people to believe her. She said, "I didn't want to hurt him. I loved him." But her actions didn't match her words. This made the jury wonder if she was telling the truth or trying to manipulate the court. In the end, Jodi Arias was convicted of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase of the trial lasted for months, while the jury decided whether she should get the death penalty. They couldn't agree on a decision, so in 2015, Arias was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even though Jodi Arias is serving her sentence in Arizona, the media still focuses on her case. Her actions, trial, and the way people view her have made her one of the most well-known women in criminal history. Before being sentenced, Arias said, "I do not fear death. I'm at peace with what's happened." Her case continues to make people think about her motives, her behaviour, and whether she truly feels remorse for what she did. Sometimes actions like these are caused by deep emotional pain, as we saw with Leslie McSpadden, who went from mourning the loss of her son to becoming a powerful advocate for justice. Her journey was fueled by anger toward a system she believed had failed her son, and she became determined to fight for justice in his memory. 5. Leslie McSpadden, the grief-stricken mother who became a voice for justice. Leslie McSpadden is a name synonymous with tragedy, grief, and the fight for justice. As the mother of Michael Brown, an 18-year-old who was fatally shot by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, McSpadden's life was forever altered when her son's death sparked nationwide protests and conversations about race, police brutality, and systemic injustice. Michael Brown was killed on August 9, 2014, by Officer Darren Wilson, an event that triggered months of unrest in Ferguson. The shooting was controversial, as witness accounts varied. Some believed Brown had his hands up in a sign of surrender, while others, including Officer Wilson, insisted Brown had charged at him. The case ignited debates over police use of force and the treatment of black Americans by law enforcement, with McSpadden at the centre of it all. In the wake of her son's death, McSpadden's grief was palpable, but it soon transformed into determination to bring justice for Michael. She became an advocate for justice reform, especially in the wake of the grand jury's decision not to indict Officer Wilson, a verdict that left McSpadden devastated. She was quoted saying, "They took my son's life. I want justice for him, for all of us. This has to stop." Her words became a rallying cry for many who believed the justice system had failed her son. Though Leslie McSpadden was never a criminal herself, her emotional journey and her transformation into a public figure fighting for justice for her son have left an indelible mark on American society. She went on to co-author a memoir, Tell the Truth and Shame the Devil, which recounts her experiences and the struggle for reform following Michael Brown's death. In her fight for justice, McSpadden has shown remarkable resilience, speaking out at rallies and meetings with lawmakers and participating in national conversations about racial injustice. She has also spoken about the emotional toll the case took on her, stating, "Every day, I live with the pain of losing my child, but I'm going to make sure his death wasn't in vain. I have to keep fighting." Leslie McSpadden's story is a powerful reminder of the enduring pain of losing a child to violence and the strength that can emerge in the face of such heartache. Although she did not face an execution or death sentence, her fight continues to seek justice for her son, Michael Brown, and for others who have suffered similar losses in the battle against systemic injustice. All these events don't exclude Hollywood stars and entertainers. Let's see Claudine Longuet's glamorous life as a singer and actress took a dark turn when she shot her lover, Olympic skier Vladimir Spider Sabic, which was between a tragic accident and a crime of passion hiding a much deeper secret. 4. Claudine Longuet, the tragic figure behind a sensational murder. Claudine Longuet, a French-born singer and actress, was known for her career and her marriage to famous singer Andy Williams. But her name became infamous in the 1970s after a tragic event that shocked the public. In 1976, her boyfriend, professional skier Spider Sabic, was shot and killed, and the story of what happened became a media sensation. The incident took place on March 21, 1976 in Aspen, Colorado, during a domestic argument between Longuet and Sabic. Claudine claimed that the gun went off by accident while she was handling it, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The prosecution believed that the shooting was intentional and that Claudine had shot Spider on purpose. She was arrested and charged with manslaughter, but the case was full of mystery and intrigue. During the trial, Longuet's defense team argued that the shooting was truly an accident, caused by fear and confusion. Her lawyer said, "This was a tragic accident. Claudine is not a violent person. She loved Spider very much." But the prosecution wasn't convinced. They suggested that Claudine might have had other reasons for the shooting, like jealousy or problems in her relationship with Sabic. Despite the seriousness of the charges, Claudine was acquitted of murder and convicted of misdemeanor manslaughter. She was sentenced to only 30 days in jail and was released after a few weeks. Some people believed that her celebrity status helped her get such a light sentence, but the case also brought attention to the complexities of domestic violence and toxic relationships. After the trial, Claudine stepped away from the spotlight and lived a quieter life. The shooting and the trial were big parts of her public story, but she never faced the death penalty or execution. Her case became an example of how sometimes the truth behind tragic events can be hard to understand. In court, Claudine said, "I never meant for this to happen. It was a horrible accident. I loved Spider, and I never wanted to hurt him." Her case remains a reminder of how public fascination with celebrity scandals often blends with the search for justice. Next, we'll look at a shocking story of a woman who survived the 9/11 attacks and became a symbol of strength. But later, the truth came out about the lies she told, which made everyone question her true motives. 3. Tanya Head, the woman who fabricated a heroic 9/11 story. Tanya Head is a name tied to one of the most bizarre and tragic cases of false identity in modern history. a woman who became a symbol of resilience and heroism after the 9/11 attacks, Head's story captivated many, until it was uncovered that she had fabricated nearly every detail of her narrative. Head claimed to be a survivor of the World Trade Center disaster who had narrowly escaped death. She presented herself as someone who was in the South Tower when it was struck and lost her fiancé in the attacks. In the years following, she became an active member of the World Trade Center Survivors Network and was a prominent voice within the community of survivors. Her story of loss, pain, and survival resonated with many, and she was even featured in news articles and documentaries about the tragedy. But as time passed, cracks began to appear in her story. In 2007, investigators discovered that Tanya Head had never been in the South Tower on 9/11 and that her entire account was fabricated. She had no fiancé who had died in the attacks, nor had she even worked at the World Trade Center. Her real name was actually Ana Maria Garcia, a Spanish woman with no ties to the events of that fateful day. Head's deceit was exposed after a journalist began to piece together discrepancies in her narrative, and the truth came to light. Once caught, Head admitted to fabricating the entire story, though she explained that she had done so as a means to feel connected to a tragic event and gain sympathy. She was charged with identity theft and fraud for her actions, but she was never convicted of any serious criminal charges. The psychological and emotional damage caused by her deception, however, left an indelible mark on the survivors' community. As for her last moments, Tanya Head's fall from grace was not marked by a dramatic criminal trial, nor did she face the death penalty, as she was never sentenced to execution. Instead, she faded from the public eye after the scandal, leaving behind a trail of questions about the nature of identity, grief, and the consequences of seeking sympathy by lying. Head's story is a haunting reminder of how the desire for recognition, even through deception, can have profound effects on both individuals and the communities they claim to be a part of. And then let's unveil the woman who beats the prison system to commit another crime. Was it an act of self-defense, or a chilling glimpse into the darkness of revenge and rage behind bars? 2. Chandra Whitewolf, a tragic story of crime and consequences. Chandra Whitewolf became known after the heartbreaking death of her 16-month-old son, an event that shocked her community and led to a long legal battle. Her case was full of tragic and disturbing details, and it ended with her being convicted of murder. In 2002, Chandra Whitewolf was convicted of killing her son, and the case received a lot of attention. Her son was found dead in their home, and an autopsy showed that he had suffered blunt force trauma, which led to charges being filed against Chandra. At the time, Chandra was in a troubled relationship and dealing with personal issues. During the trial, Chandra's defense team argued that the death was an accident or tied to her struggles with mental health. However, the prosecution believed that Chandra intentionally caused her son's death. In the end, the jury found her guilty of second-degree murder. One of the most emotional moments in the trial was when Chandra testified. She cried as she said, "I never meant to hurt him. I loved him with all my heart." But the jury was convinced by the evidence, and she was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Chandra's case is a reminder of how complex the justice system can be, especially when mental health and domestic issues are involved. Though she didn't face the death penalty, her actions led to the tragic loss of her son and changed her life forever. Now, let's look at Pamela Smart's case, which also grabbed national attention. Her story involved a love affair that ended in murder. But the big question is whether Pamela was the mastermind behind her husband's death, or if she was manipulated by a young lover who was easily influenced. Pamela Smart, a scandalous crime that captured national attention. Pamela Smart became well known in the early 1990s for her role in the murder of her husband Greg Smart, a case that shocked the nation. Smart, a 22-year-old high school media coordinator, was convicted of helping to plan her husband's brutal murder in 1990. What made the case even more sensational was that she was having an affair with a 15-year-old student, Billy Flynn, who was involved in the murder along with two of his friends. The murder, and Pamela's role in it, made headlines across the country. The trial started in 1991 and revealed a web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. Pamela was accused of persuading Flynn to help kill her husband. The prosecution portrayed her as a manipulative woman who used her relationship with Flynn to convince him to commit murder. Throughout the trial, Pamela insisted that she didn't want her husband dead and had only been having an affair with Flynn. She said, "I didn't want him dead, I didn't want my life to be ruined, I didn't plan this." However, the prosecution presented taped confessions from Flynn and the other young men involved, where they explained how Pamela had convinced them to kill her husband. The evidence against her, including her affair with a minor, was strong, and she was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Pamela Smart was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Even though she was convicted of such a serious crime, Pamela was not given the death penalty. The case still sparks debate, with some people thinking her sentence was too harsh because of her age and the situation, while others believe she should be fully responsible for causing her husband's death. Pamela Smart's case remains one of the most infamous crimes in American history, mainly because of the media attention and the twisted nature of the crime. While she wasn't sentenced to death, her story is a tragic example of how manipulation and inappropriate relationships can lead to terrible consequences.